They called me incorruptible. For 17 years, I had maintained the ritual logs of Forge World Metallica, documenting the sacred transformations of flesh into blessed steel, recording every augmentation with precision that earned me commendation from the Archmagos himself. I believed the machine god watched through my optic implants. I believed every replacement of weakness with strength brought us closer to divine perfection. My name is Lex Mechanic Tertius Vaughn, and I want you to understand something before you judge me. I was faithful before I was horrified. The morning of my transformation into doubt began like every other for the past 6,219 days. My chronometer registered the hour of awakening at precisely 5 hours before zenith, the vibration through my spinal augmetic pulling me from dormancy with mechanical efficiency. The HAB unit temperature stood at 16 degrees, cold enough to slow organic processes, warm enough to prevent frostbite on what remained of my original flesh. My left arm, my right leg, 47% of my torso. These were still meat, still vulnerable, still awaiting the blessing of replacement. I performed the litany of ignition, 16 words in binaric cant, feeling the sacred syllables resonate through the vox grill embedded in my throat. My cogitator implants initialized, flooding my consciousness with the day's scheduled rituals, and I felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with knowing exactly what the Omnissiah required of me. The walk from Habitation Block 7 to Archive Theta took 19 minutes through corridors that hummed with the constant drone of servitor processing. The air tasted of machine oil and ozone, that particular flavor of consecrated industry that defined every breath on a forge world. My workstation materialized from the red-lit gloom exactly where it always was, surrounded by data stacks containing the complete augmentation histories of 200,000 souls who had undergone the sacred flesh-weakening procedures. My duty was simple and pure. I logged every replacement, verified that proper litanies had been recited during installation, cross-referenced component serial numbers against approved manufactorum outputs, and maintained the records that proved each transformation brought glory to the machine god. The Archmagos called my work the foundation of our faith, the proof that we honored the Omnissiah's commandments with precision. I believed him. The pride I felt when reviewing my error-free logs was the closest thing to joy my augmented neurology still permitted. That morning's assignment began with reviewing the augmentation schedule for Cohort 97, a group of 143 Scutari who were to receive enhanced targeting arrays and reinforced skeletal structures, standard upgrades, blessed procedures, the kind of work I had processed thousands of times. I pulled the preliminary assessment files, cross-checked medical histories against compatibility matrices, verified that each candidate had completed the required 3 months of spiritual preparation. Everything aligned with protocol. Everything made sense. I advanced to the surgical allocation logs, matching each soldier to their assigned Magos biologists, confirming operating theater availability, ensuring the sacred oils had been properly consecrated. My cogitator hummed with satisfaction as each verification came back clean. This was my purpose. This was my service to the machine god. Then I noticed the annotation on file 73, a small detail easily missed if I had been less meticulous. The candidate, designation Scutari Primus Hectus Vorn, had been scheduled for cranial augmentation 3 days prior, a rush procedure outside normal rotation. The note simply read, "Emergency replacement following combat malfunction." I pulled up the combat records, searching for the incident that would have necessitated such urgent intervention. The data slate showed nothing. No recent deployments, no training accidents, no recorded malfunctions of any kind. Vorn's service history indicated he had been on garrison duty for the past 2 months, performing routine patrol operations that involved no combat whatsoever. I stared at the discrepancy for 11 seconds, feeling something uncomfortable stir in the organic portions of my brain, something my augmetics couldn't quite suppress. An error, I decided. A clerical mistake. Perhaps the wrong file had been referenced. I flagged it for correction and continued my work, though the unease lingered like a stubborn prayer that wouldn't quite resolve. The rest of the morning proceeded according to schedule. I processed 63 augmentation files, approved 47 surgical requisitions, verified the consecration logs for 12 separate operating theaters. My hands moved with practiced efficiency. My cogitator parsed data with flawless accuracy, and the machine god's work advanced through my faithful service. I took my midday sustenance at the 12th hour, nutrient-paced with the texture of industrial lubricant and twice the spiritual value. Consumed while reviewing the monthly statistical summaries. The numbers told a story of constant improvement. Augmentation rates up 7%, rejection incidents down to near statistical zero, spiritual compliance at 98.6% across all cohorts. These were the metrics of a healthy forge, a faithful congregation, a population properly dedicated to transcending the weakness of flesh. I felt satisfaction pulse through my reward circuits, that blessed sensation of duty fulfilled. But when I returned to my terminal, I found myself pulling up Skitarii Primus Vorn's file again. Not because I needed to, not because it was part of my scheduled work. I told myself I was simply being thorough, exercising the diligence that had earned my reputation. I cross-referenced his cranial augmentation against the surgical logs, finding the procedure documented exactly as it should be. Standard Cortex upgrade package, performed by Magos biologist Quintus Rowe. No complications noted. I should have been satisfied. Instead, I found myself checking Rowe's other recent procedures, searching for something I couldn't quite name. 27 surgeries in the past month, all routine, all properly logged. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have concerned me. Except procedure 19, another emergency cranial augmentation, another Skitarii with no recent combat history. Same annotation. Emergency replacement following combat malfunction. I pulled the deployment records. The soldier had been assigned to archival guard duty for 4 months. No combat, no malfunction, no reason for emergency surgery. I sat motionless at my terminal for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. My organic heart rate elevated enough that my diagnostic subroutines flagged it as anomalous. I ran the prayer of calm calculation, feeling the familiar words settle my thoughts into proper order. There would be an explanation. The machine god's work was perfect, and any apparent discrepancy was simply my limited understanding failing to grasp the larger pattern. Perhaps these soldiers had experienced malfunctions during routine activities, incidents minor enough not to warrant combat log entries. Perhaps the definition of combat malfunction included categories I hadn't considered. Perhaps I was seeing shadows where only sacred light existed. I continued my work. I processed files. I verified logs. I maintained the records that kept our forge running with divine precision. But when the work cycle ended at the 18th hour and I walked back through those humming corridors to my HAB unit, I couldn't stop my cogitator from running calculations in the background, couldn't prevent my organic brain from circling back to those 2 files like a damaged servitor stuck in a loop. I performed my evening rituals, recited the litany of grateful function, applied sacred oils to my mechanical components with appropriate reverence. I entered dormancy at the 22nd hour, exactly as scheduled, and I dreamed, in the way that partially augmented humans still dream, of surgical theaters where the lights never quite revealed what happened in the shadows between the tables. The morning of my second day of doubt began with a decision I told myself was righteous. I would investigate the discrepancy properly, document my findings, and present them to my supervisor with solutions already in place. This was how faithful servants of the machine god handled irregularities, with systematic analysis and humble correction. I pulled the complete surgical archive for Magos biologist Quintus Rowe, 6 years of procedures, and began cross-referencing emergency cranial augmentations against combat deployment records. My cogitator processed the data in 17 minutes. The results made my remaining organic blood temperature drop 2 degrees. 143 emergency cranial augmentations in the past 3 years. 143 Skitarii, marked for rush procedures outside normal augmentation schedules. I pulled the combat histories for all of them, expecting to find patterns of deployment, evidence of battlefield stress that would explain the urgent need. Instead, I found something that made the sacred litanies falter on my Vox grill. 71 of the 143 had been on garrison duty or administrative assignment when their emergency procedures occurred. No combat exposure, no equipment malfunctions, no documented incidents of any kind that would necessitate cranial replacement. I stared at the data for 8 minutes, my thought processes fragmenting between what I was seeing and what I wanted to believe I was seeing. There had to be a pattern I was missing, a classification system I didn't understand, some blessed explanation that would make this make sense. I expanded my search parameters, pulling surgical logs from other Magos biologists, checking if this was a Forge-wide documentation issue or something specific to Rose procedures. The archive contained records for 43 active surgical magi across Forge World Metallica. I ran the same cross-reference: emergency cranial augmentations versus actual combat necessity. By midday, I had processed the complete data set. The numbers settled into my consciousness like ash from a crematorium. 687 emergency cranial augmentations in the past 5 years across the entire Forge. 392 of them performed on Skitarii with no combat-related justification. More than half of the emergency replacements were happening to soldiers who hadn't experienced anything that could remotely be called a malfunction requiring urgent intervention. I sat at my terminal, feeling something I had thought my augmentations had removed. Fear. Not the clean, manageable fear of mechanical failure or enemy contact, but something deeper and more corrosive. Fear that came from understanding that the numbers I was seeing couldn't be documentation errors. Not at this scale. Not across 43 different surgical teams. Not over 5 years of continuous operations. This was either massive systematic incompetence, which my faith in the Mechanicus told me was impossible, or it was something else entirely. Something I couldn't name, because naming it would mean admitting that the sacred work I had been documenting for 17 years might contain within it something that wasn't sacred at all. I should have reported my findings. I should have brought this to my supervisor, to the Archmagos, to someone whose augmented wisdom exceeded my own. Instead, I found myself pulling individual case files, reading the detailed surgical reports for these emergency procedures, searching for the explanation that would restore my certainty. The files were thorough, as all Mechanicus documentation was thorough. Each surgery was logged with precision. Incision coordinates, component removal specifications, replacement unit serial numbers, post-operative functionality assessments. Everything proper, everything blessed, everything exactly as it should be, except for one detail that appeared in file after file after file. In the section marked Original Component Disposition, where we documented what happened to the removed flesh or failing augmetic, nearly every emergency cranial augmentation contained the same notation: organic cortex disposal via standard incineration protocols, not malfunctioning cortex or damaged brain tissue, or any phrasing that would indicate something wrong with what was being removed. Just organic cortex, as if the problem wasn't that the original brain had failed, but simply that it existed. My hands, both the flesh one and the augmetic one, began to shake. I ran the litany of steady function 3 times. The shaking continued. I pulled up the standard medical protocols for cranial augmentation, the sacred texts that guided us in properly replacing weak flesh with blessed machinery. The procedures were clear. Full cranial augmentation was reserved for cases where organic brain tissue had been damaged beyond repair by combat trauma, disease, or catastrophic augmetic malfunction. It was not a routine upgrade. It was not something you did to healthy soldiers assigned to garrison duty. The human brain, even in the Mechanicus, even among the faithful who sought transcendence through steel, was considered the sacred seat of consciousness, to be replaced only when absolutely necessary. Yet here were 392 cases where it had been replaced anyway, where healthy cortical tissue had been removed and incinerated, where the organic seat of thought and memory and identity had been cut out and replaced with cogitator arrays, where soldiers had walked into surgical theaters as men and walked out as something that only resembled men from the outside. I closed the files. I logged out of my terminal. I walked to the sanctum of the machine god. and knelt before the altar of sacred cogs for 1 hour, praying for understanding, praying for wisdom, praying for the Omnissiah to show me what I was missing. The incense burned with its usual acrid sweetness. The prayers echoed off walls lined with holy circuitry. The machine god, as always, answered only with silence and the eternal hum of mechanisms grinding through their blessed cycles. When I returned to my hab unit that night, I made a decision that I would later recognize as the moment I stepped off the path of simple faith into something darker and more complicated. I accessed the personnel archives, something technically outside my clearance, but not so far outside that the security protocols flagged it. I pulled the service records for 20 of the Skitarii who had undergone emergency cranial augmentation. I wanted to see what happened to them afterward, whether their service improved, whether the blessed replacements had brought them closer to the Omnissiah's perfection. What I found was a pattern so precise it could only be intentional. Every single Skitarii who received emergency cranial augmentation was reassigned within 1 month of surgery, not to better positions, not to more prestigious combat roles. They were transferred to the most dangerous deployments available: frontline assault cohorts facing orc warbands, suicide missions against Necron tomb complexes, boarding actions against chaos vessels, high casualty operations where life expectancy was measured in weeks or months at best. And the casualty reports confirmed what the assignment pattern suggested. 19 of the 20 soldiers I tracked had been killed in action within 6 months of their cranial augmentation. The 20th had been listed as missing, presumed dead, after his cohort was annihilated in a failed attempt to reclaim a hive city from tyrannid infestation. I sat in the darkness of my hab unit, my optic implants casting red light across the bare walls, and felt something crack inside whatever remained of my organic mind. The pattern was too clean, too systematic, too perfect to be coincidence. Soldiers were being selected for emergency cranial augmentation when nothing was wrong with them. Their organic brains were being removed and destroyed. They were being rebuilt with complete neural replacement. Then they were being sent to die in situations where retrieval of their augmetics would be impossible, where what had been done to them would be buried under rubble or lost in the void, or consumed by alien monstrosities. The question that I couldn't suppress, the question that destroyed 17 years of faithful certainty, burned through my cogitator with the persistence of a virus. Why would the Mechanicus do this to its own soldiers? What possible purpose could justify the systematic replacement of functional organic brains with mechanical alternatives, followed immediately by deployment to near certain death? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't enter dormancy while my thought processes ran in circles, analyzing and reanalyzing the data, searching for the innocent explanation that would let me return to faith. Morning came. I went to my terminal. I continued my work because I didn't know what else to do. But everything had changed. Every file I processed, every augmentation I verified, every surgical log I cross-referenced, now I was seeing it through different optics, through the lens of a question I couldn't unask. By the end of that week, I had expanded my investigation across every Forge world in the sector, whose records I could access. The pattern existed everywhere. Hundreds of emergency cranial augmentations performed on healthy soldiers, thousands across the sector over decades, always followed by reassignment to high-casualty operations, always ending in death or disappearance. The scale of it was staggering, the precision terrifying. This wasn't corruption. This wasn't some rogue magos pursuing forbidden knowledge. This was policy, executed across multiple Forge worlds, maintained over generations, documented with the same meticulous care we applied to every other sacred duty. I pulled up the augmentation schedules for the next month, already knowing what I would find. Cohort 97, the 143 Skitarii I had been processing that first morning, were scheduled for their surgeries to begin in 3 days. I opened their files with hands that had forgotten how to stay steady. I read their service histories. I looked at their deployment records. They were garrison troops, administrative personnel, logistics specialists, soldiers who had committed no crimes, suffered no malfunctions, demonstrated no failures that would require intervention. And in 4 days, if the schedule proceeded as planned, They would enter surgical theaters as men who still possessed their own thoughts, their own memories, their own capacity for doubt or question or fear. They would emerge as something else entirely, their organic minds incinerated as medical waste, replaced with cogitator arrays that could be controlled with perfect precision. And within a month, they would be dead, sent to die in battles that would ensure no one could examine what had been done to them. I thought about reporting this. I thought about taking my findings to the Archmagos, about trusting that somewhere in the hierarchy there existed someone who would see what I was seeing and be as horrified as I was. But then I pulled up the authorization codes on the surgical orders for Cohort 97, following the chain of approval back through the administrative architecture of the Forge. The orders originated from the Archmagos himself. They were signed with his personal seal. The man I would have reported to was the one who had ordered it. That night, I returned to the sanctum and knelt before the altar again. But this time, I didn't pray for understanding. I prayed for something else entirely. Something I barely knew how to put into words. I prayed that I was wrong. I prayed that my limited comprehension was missing some vital context that would transform this horror into holy necessity. I prayed for someone to tell me that what I had discovered was not what it appeared to be. The machine god answered with the same eternal silence. The mechanisms ground on. The Forge continued its sacred work. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like my remaining organic neurons dying one by one, that I was alone with this knowledge, that no one was going to save me from what I now understood, that I had 3 days to decide whether I was going to remain complicit in what was about to happen to 143 souls who trusted that their augmentation would bring them closer to the Omnissiah. I pulled up the files again. I looked at their faces, those that still had organic faces. I read their names. I thought about the prayer I had recited every morning for 17 years. In service to the machine god, may my labor prove worthy. And I wondered, with a despair that my augmentics couldn't filter away, what kind of god would consider this labor worthy of anything but damnation. The morning of my comprehension began with an act I had never considered possible. I accessed restricted Archmagos files without authorization, hacking through security protocols that my own cogitator implants gave me partial access to. If I was going to betray everything I believed, I needed to understand why. I needed to know what justified this. I needed someone to explain to me why the systematic harvest of healthy brains was considered sacred duty. I found the answer in a document dated 3 centuries old, authored by a council of senior magi and bearing the seal of Mars itself. The file was titled Operational Directive Gamma 7, Neural Loyalty Assurance Protocol. I read it in my HAB unit with my door sealed and my Vox grill disabled. It took 47 minutes to read the complete document. By the end, I understood everything, and understanding was worse than ignorance could ever be. The document began with a problem statement. Skitarii forces, despite augmentation and conditioning, occasionally exhibited failures of obedience when exposed to extended garrison duty or non-combat assignments. Soldiers granted time to think, to question, to remember their humanity, sometimes developed philosophical concerns about their purpose. Some had refused orders. Some had questioned the righteousness of their deployments. Some had even deserted. The numbers were small, less than 2% across the sector, but the document treated this as an unacceptable systemic vulnerability. Faith alone, it argued, was insufficient to guarantee absolute obedience across all cohorts under all conditions. The solution was elegant in its horror. Identify soldiers showing early indicators of independent thought before that independence manifested as disobedience. The document listed 47 behavioral markers that supposedly predicted future loyalty failures. Asking questions about mission parameters, expressing concern for civilian casualties, showing excessive attachment to non-augmented personnel, demonstrating empathy beyond operational necessity, requesting information about the strategic purpose of orders. Normal human behaviors, reframed as warning signs of dangerous individuality. Soldiers flagged by these indicators were to be selected for emergency cranial augmentation, regardless of medical necessity. Their organic brains, the source of their potentially disloyal thoughts, would be removed and replaced with cogitator arrays programmed for perfect obedience. The procedure was documented as emergency because it was performed outside the standard religious framework that required lengthy spiritual preparation. It had to be fast, had to happen before the soldier realized they were being targeted, had to be irreversible before questions could be asked. And the post-surgical deployment to high-casualty operations served a dual purpose. First, it removed the possibility of long-term study that might reveal what had been done. Second, it provided a testing ground for the neural replacements under extreme combat stress. The document called it quality assurance. I called it murder with extra steps. But the document didn't present this as cruel. It presented it as necessary. It argued that the survival of the Imperium depended on absolute reliability of military forces, that the existence of even small percentages of potentially disloyal soldiers represented an existential threat to humanity's war against infinite enemies. It quoted sacred texts, cited statistical models of sector-wide collapse scenarios, presented philosophical arguments about the moral acceptability of sacrificing individual consciousness for collective survival. The logic was comprehensive, carefully constructed, almost persuasive if you could ignore the fact that it was justifying the systematic destruction of human minds as a preventive measure against the possibility that those minds might someday hesitate. I read the document twice. The second time, I cross-referenced the behavioral indicators against my own recent actions. I had questioned documentation. I had investigated discrepancies without authorization. I had accessed restricted files. I had begun to doubt the righteousness of the Mechanicus hierarchy. By the metrics defined in Operational Directive Gamma 7, I myself was now a candidate for neural loyalty assurance. I sat with that realization for 11 minutes, feeling my organic heart rate climb while my augmetic systems tried and failed to regulate the panic response. I was living on borrowed time, waiting for someone to notice that the meticulous Lex mechanic who had served faithfully for 17 years was now exhibiting exactly the patterns that marked him for erasure. I pulled up Cohort 97's files again and looked at them with new understanding. These soldiers hadn't committed crimes. They had simply been human in ways the Mechanicus had decided were dangerous. I read through their behavioral assessments, the notes that had marked them for harvesting. One had requested clarification about why civilians in a reclaimed hive section were being executed alongside obvious heretics. One had expressed concern about the spiritual preparation time for augmentation being shortened. One had asked if there were alternatives to a particular suicide mission that would achieve the same strategic objective. Small things, human things, things that demonstrated they still possessed the capacity to think rather than simply obey. And in 3 days, that capacity would be cut out of their skulls and burned. I tried to work that day. I couldn't. My hands moved through the motions of processing files, but my cogitator was caught in loops, analyzing the same questions from every angle. Who knew about this? How high did this policy extend? Was this limited to Forge World Metallica, or was it standard practice across the entire Mechanicus? How many soldiers had been erased over the centuries, their minds discarded like failed components, replaced with machinery that wouldn't question or doubt or remember what it meant to be human? At the 13th hour, my terminal received a summons. The Archmagos wanted to see me. No explanation provided, no context given, just a direct order to report to his sanctum immediately. I stood from my workstation with a terrible certainty that my investigation had been discovered, that my unauthorized access had triggered security protocols, that I was about to be offered a choice between surgical theater and execution. The walk to the Archmagos' sanctum took 12 minutes through corridors that suddenly felt like the approaches to a crematorium. The guards at his door, heavily augmented Scutari with weapons that hummed with barely contained violence, scanned my credentials and let me pass without comment. The sanctum itself was a chamber of brass and steel, walls lined with sacred mechanisms that ground through their eternal cycles, the air thick with incense and the ozone smell of active power systems. Archmagos Dominus Kael stood at a workbench, his back to me, his form more machine than man. augmentics covering 90% of what had once been human flesh. He spoke without turning, his vox grill giving his words a flat mechanical quality that stripped away any possibility of warmth. Lex Mechanic Tertius Von, your work has been exemplary. 17 years without significant error. I have reviewed your performance assessments personally. He turned then, and his optic implants focused on me with the precision of targeting arrays. It has come to my attention that you have been accessing files outside your assigned parameters. I didn't attempt to deny it. My augmentics wouldn't have permitted the necessary deception protocols. Yes, Archmagos, I discovered discrepancies in surgical documentation. I was attempting to understand them. Discrepancies. He repeated the word as if examining a curious artifact. Interesting terminology. Most would call them patterns. Systematic patterns, implemented with precision across multiple forge worlds over centuries. He moved closer, servos whirring in his mechanical legs. Tell me, Lex Mechanic, what did you conclude from your investigation? This was the moment. The choice between truth and comfortable lie. I chose truth because I was tired of pretending. I concluded that we are systematically removing the organic brains of soldiers who demonstrate independent thought, replacing them with cogitator arrays to ensure perfect obedience, then deploying them to high-casualty operations to prevent long-term examination of what we've done. Accurate summary. His response came without hesitation, without defensiveness, with the same tone he might use to confirm a mathematical equation. You omitted the strategic justification, but the mechanical analysis is sound. Approximately 600 soldiers per year across this forge world alone. 7,000 annually across the sector. For 3 centuries. More than 2 million individual neural replacements, each one preventing potential loyalty failure. The numbers hit like physical impacts. 2 million. 2 million human minds cut out and destroyed because they might someday question orders. I felt something in my chest that could have been my organic heart breaking or my augmentic power core straining under emotional feedback. How can you call that justified? The Archmagos was silent for 17 seconds. When he spoke again, his vox grill somehow managed to sound tired despite its mechanical flatness. Sit, Lex Mechanic. I am going to tell you something that will not comfort you, but perhaps it will help you understand why I have been signing those surgical orders for 93 years. I sat. He moved to his workbench. His hands, more precise than human hands could ever be, began assembling something I couldn't identify from components that looked like pieces of a data cogitator. He worked while he talked, and I realized he needed the familiar motion to steady himself for what he was about to say. I was present at the Council of Magi when Operational Directive Gamma 7 was first proposed. I argued against it. I said it violated the fundamental principle that consciousness, even flawed consciousness, was sacred to the machine god. I lost that argument. The other Magi presented evidence I could not refute. Statistical analysis showing that sectors with stricter loyalty assurance protocols experienced 47% fewer internal conflicts, 33% better operational compliance, and survived external threats at rates significantly higher than sectors that permitted doctrinal flexibility. They demonstrated that faith alone was insufficient. That doubt, even reasonable doubt, created vulnerabilities that our enemies would exploit. That the Imperium exists in such a state of permanent crisis that we cannot afford soldiers who hesitate, who question, who require explanations before obeying. His hands never stopped moving, placing components with precise care. I asked them what right we had to erase human minds preemptively, before any crime had been committed. They asked me what right we had to risk sector-wide collapse to preserve the consciousness of individuals who might, through their questioning, cause the deaths of millions. They asked me if I was willing to accept responsibility for the catastrophe that would follow if we maintained doctrinal purity while our defense forces fragmented. They asked me if my moral certainty was worth the extinction of forge worlds. He paused, his hands hovering over the assembly. I did not have answers they found acceptable. Neither did I have faith that my principles were worth the cost of being wrong. So I voted with the majority. I implemented the directive. And for 93 years, I have signed the surgical orders, knowing exactly what they mean, carrying the weight of every consciousness we've erased. Then why continue? The question came out sharper than I intended. If you know it's wrong, why keep doing it? The Archmagos turned to face me fully. Because inaction is also a choice, and that choice has consequences I am equally unwilling to accept. If I refuse to sign the orders, someone else will. Someone who doesn't carry the weight, who doesn't question, who signs with the certainty of faith rather than the burden of doubt. At least when I sign, I remember what we're doing. At least I force myself to read every file, every name, every behavioral assessment. At least I carry the knowledge that we are committing ongoing atrocity in service of survival. He moved closer, and I saw something in his optic implants I hadn't expected. Not righteousness, not certainty, but exhaustion. I don't know if this is right, Lex Mechanic. I have never known. I have lain awake in dormancy for decades wrestling with it. But the alternative is rolling the dice on sector defense, permitting vulnerabilities we know exist, and hoping that faith alone will be sufficient when the Tyranids arrive, or the Necrons wake, or the next chaos incursion tears through our worlds. I choose the certainty of small horror over the possibility of larger one. I choose to be the monster who remembers he's a monster, rather than the faithful who never questions. And I live with the weight, because someone must be willing to carry it. I stared at him, this machine man who had just admitted to 3 centuries of systematic murder, while simultaneously explaining why stopping would be worse. What happens to me now? That, he said, returning to his workbench, depends on what you choose to do with what you know. Your investigation was noted. Your behavioral patterns match several indicators in the directive. By the protocols I helped write, you should be scheduled for neural loyalty assurance within the month. He finished assembling whatever he'd been building, a small data core with intricate circuitry. But you are also the most meticulous record keeper this forge has seen in a century. Your work is genuinely valuable. Your doubt is reasonable rather than hysterical. And I find myself wondering if perhaps the directive is too broad, too aggressive in its identification of dangerous individuality. He held up the data core. This contains the complete documentation of Operational Directive Gamma 7, including implementation records, statistical outcomes, and the names of every soldier we've processed. It also contains my personal logs, 93 years of doubt and self-justification, and attempts to convince myself I'm not simply a murderer with bureaucratic authority. I am giving it to you because I no longer trust my own judgment on this matter. Why me? Because you asked the right questions. Because you investigated systematically rather than reactively. Because you remind me of who I was before I learned to live with horror. He placed the data core in my hand, his mechanical fingers cold against my organic palm. You have 3 choices, Lex Mechanic. First, you can accept neural loyalty assurance. You will lose your capacity for doubt, but you will continue to serve, and your skills will not be wasted. Second, you can leave this sanctum and say nothing. Remain in your position, process the surgical orders for Cohort 97, and continue your work as if this conversation never happened. Third, you can take what you know and attempt to expose this, to force the Mechanicus to confront what it's doing. That choice will likely result in your death, and I cannot predict whether your testimony would change anything or simply be classified and forgotten. He returned to his workbench, dismissing me without another word. You have until the morning. Cohort 97 surgeries begin at the 6th hour. If you choose the third option, understand that I will not protect you. I will sign your execution warrant with the same exhausted resignation I used to sign everything else. But I will read it. I will remember your name, and I will carry the weight of your death along with all the others. I left his sanctum holding the data core like it was a live explosive. I walked back through corridors that hummed with the same eternal industry, back to my HAB unit where everything was exactly as I'd left it, back to a life that would never again feel like home. I sat in the darkness with the data core glowing softly in my hands, and I thought about faith and duty and the terrible mathematics of survival that justified erasing 2 million minds over 3 centuries. I thought about Cohort 97, 143 soldiers who would wake tomorrow morning not knowing it was their last day of thinking for themselves. I thought about the soldier who had asked for clarification about civilian executions, a question that now marked him for mental death. I thought about the fact that my investigation, my doubts, my capacity to question, these were exactly the traits the directive was designed to eliminate. And I thought about the Archmagos, that exhausted machine man who had given me information that could destroy him, not because he thought I would succeed in exposing the horror, but because he needed someone else to carry the weight of knowing. He had been alone with this knowledge for 93 years. He had made his choice and lived with it, signing orders and maintaining the system while his conscience slowly corroded. He had offered me the same choice: become complicit, become erased, or become a martyr whose death would change nothing. I accessed the data core. I read his logs. 93 years of entries, starting with passionate opposition and slowly, incrementally, year by year, transforming into weary acceptance. I watched through his own words as he convinced himself that pragmatism was wisdom, that the capacity to commit horror while feeling guilt about it was somehow morally superior to refusing to commit horror at all. I saw the moment, 30 years into his tenure, when he stopped writing "this is wrong" and started writing "this is necessary." I saw the transformation from a magos who questioned to a magos who simply functioned, who had learned to compartmentalize the horror so effectively that he could sign death warrants while eating his morning rations, could approve neural harvesting while reciting prayers to the machine god, could maintain perfect efficiency while his soul corroded into something that barely resembled conscience. His final entry was dated 3 days prior. It read, "I met a Lex mechanic today who reminds me of who I used to be. I am giving him the choice I never gave myself. I don't know if this is mercy or cruelty. I suspect it doesn't matter. The weight remains regardless." I closed the data core and sat in darkness for the remainder of the night, listening to my chronometer count down the hours until Cohort 97 would begin their walk to the surgical theaters. At the 4th hour, I made my decision, not because I was brave, not because I thought I could change anything, but because I understood, with absolute clarity, that I would rather die as myself than live as whatever I would become if I accepted this. I copied the data core's contents to 17 different archive locations across the Forge's network, encrypted but recoverable by anyone with sufficient clearance and sufficient motivation to look. I composed a testimony, clinical and precise, documenting everything I had discovered, everything the Archmagos had confirmed, every name and number and surgical specification that proved the systematic nature of what we were doing. I addressed it to no one in particular because I didn't know who could be trusted with it, who would care, who would do anything other than classify it and forget it existed. Then I walked to the barracks where Cohort 97 was quartered. The guards at the entrance recognized me, assumed I was there on official business, and let me pass without question. The soldiers were in the midst of morning preparations, performing their rituals before transport to the surgical complex. I found the one who had questioned civilian executions, a young Skitari named Davin Crost, whose file said he had served with distinction for 6 years before his dangerous tendency toward empathy had marked him for erasure. He looked up when I approached, his mostly human face showing surprise at finding a Lex mechanic in the barracks. "Can I help you, sir?" I spoke quickly, quietly, knowing I had minutes at best before security noticed the irregularity. "Your scheduled augmentation this morning is not what you think it is. They're going to remove your organic brain and replace it with a cogitator array because you asked questions they didn't like. Then they're going to deploy you to a suicide mission where you'll die within 6 months. This is happening to all of you. Check your own files if you don't believe me. The authorization codes are there. The pattern is documented. You're being erased for the crime of being human." His expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, anger, fear. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone should know. Because you deserve to know. Because I can't stop this. But I can at least give you the truth before they take away your capacity to understand it." I handed him a data slate with my compiled evidence. "Do with this what you will. Tell the others or don't. Try to resist or accept it. I don't know what the right choice is. I just know you should have one." I left before he could respond, before the guards could question my presence, before I could second guess what I had just done. I walked back to my HAB unit with the certainty that I had perhaps 30 minutes before my actions were reported, before security came for me, before I was given my own choice between surgical theater and execution. I used those 30 minutes to record this testimony, speaking into a Vox recorder with my door sealed and my chronometer counting down. I documented everything: the initial discovery, the investigation, the numbers, the Archmagos' confession, my choice to warn Cohort 97. I recorded it not because I thought it would change anything, but because the act of testimony felt important. Because if I was going to die for this, I wanted there to be a record that someone had seen what was happening and refused to accept it, that someone had chosen conscience over survival, even knowing the choice was futile. At the 5th hour and 43 minutes, my door's security override activated. 6 Skitarii entered, weapons ready, faces hidden behind helmets that gave them the appearance of the machines they would eventually become. The lead soldier spoke with mechanical precision. Lex Mechanic Tertius Von, you are detained for unauthorized disclosure of classified protocols, breach of information security, and attempted interference with sanctioned operations. You will come with us. I went with them. What else could I do? They took me not to a holding cell, but directly to a surgical preparation chamber. The Archmagos was waiting, standing beside an operating table with restraints already configured. A full neural replacement rig suspended from the ceiling like a mechanical spider ready to descend and consume. He looked at me with those exhausted optic implants and spoke without preamble. Cohort 97 has been informed of your actions. 17 soldiers are currently in custody for refusing to report for augmentation. The rest proceeded as scheduled, either because they didn't believe you or because they decided compliance was preferable to resistance. Either way, you have introduced chaos into a carefully managed process. You have damaged operational efficiency. You have proven that your capacity for independent judgment poses a direct threat to Forge stability. He paused, his mechanical hands moving across a control panel with practiced efficiency. I am authorized to offer you one final choice: neural loyalty assurance with immediate effect, or execution by incineration. Both are classified as acceptable resolutions to your security breach. Both maintain operational continuity. Choose. I looked at the surgical table, at the restraints that would hold me while they cut open my skull and removed everything that made me who I was. I looked at the Archmagos, this machine man who had given me the truth and now stood ready to erase me for acting on it. I thought about the 17 soldiers who had chosen resistance, who were probably already being processed for their own neural harvesting or execution. I thought about the other 126 who had walked into surgical theaters anyway, who had chosen the comfort of obedience over the terror of truth. And I thought about what the Archmagos had said, that he lived with the weight because someone must be willing to carry it. But there was another way to bear weight, I realized. You could carry it by refusing to add more to the pile. You could carry it by saying no, even when saying no meant death, even when death changed nothing about the system's continuation. You could carry it by maintaining the dignity of choice, the last small assertion of humanity, in a system designed to erase humanity entirely. Execution, I said. My voice came out steady, filtered through my Vox grill with mechanical clarity. I choose execution. I will die as myself. Something flickered in the Archmagos' optic implants. Recognition, perhaps, or regret, or simply acknowledgement that I had chosen the path he had been too afraid to choose 93 years ago. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey respect despite the mechanical precision of its execution. So be it. He turned to the Skitarii guards. Transport him to the incineration facility. Standard execution protocol. Log it as security breach resolution. Mark his service record as terminated with cause. They took me. The walk through the corridors felt different now. No longer the familiar path of daily routine, but a final journey through a world I was about to leave. The incineration facility was exactly what its name suggested. A massive furnace used for disposal of biological waste, failed augmetic components, and apparently, Lex Mechanics, who had forgotten their place in the sacred hierarchy. The heat from the furnace was overwhelming, even at a distance, enough to make my organic skin prickle with sweat, enough to remind me that I was still partially flesh, still vulnerable, still capable of being destroyed. They placed me in the holding chamber, a small room with a reinforced door that opened directly onto the furnace entrance. Through the observation window, I could see the flames, white-hot and hungry, consuming whatever was fed to them with indiscriminate efficiency. The guard who secured the chamber door was young, his face still mostly human beneath his helmet. He hesitated before leaving, looking at me with something that might have been sympathy or might have been simply confusion about why anyone would choose this over the alternative. "Why?" he asked. Just one word, but it contained volumes. I thought about the answer for several seconds. Because if I let them erase who I am, to preserve what I am, then there's nothing left worth preserving. Because some choices matter even when they change nothing. Because I want to die knowing I was still capable of saying no. He nodded slowly, then left, sealing the door behind him. I stood alone in that chamber for 11 minutes, listening to the roar of the furnace, feeling the heat that would soon reduce me to ash and vapor. I thought about my 17 years of faithful service, all those meticulous records I had maintained, all those augmentations I had verified, all the times I had participated in the system without questioning whether my participation was justified. I thought about how easy it had been to be complicit when I didn't understand what I was complicit in. How comfortable faith had felt when I didn't know what faith was covering. And I thought about the question the Archmagos had been asking himself for 93 years. What cost is too high for survival? At what point does the horror of what we do to preserve ourselves become worse than the alternative of ceasing to exist? I didn't have an answer. I don't think there is an answer. But I knew, standing in that chamber with the furnace roaring, that I couldn't be part of a system that erased human consciousness as a preventive measure against the possibility of doubt. That whatever the Imperium was fighting to preserve, if it required the systematic harvesting of minds to maintain itself, then perhaps it wasn't worth preserving. The door to the furnace opened. The heat struck me like a physical wall, intense enough that my augmetic systems immediately began shut-down protocols to protect themselves from damage. I walked forward because there was nowhere else to go, because I had made my choice, and choices had consequences. The last thing I thought, before the flames took me, was that I hoped my testimony would survive, that someone would find it, that the 17 soldiers who had refused their augmentations would be remembered as people who had said no when saying no mattered. I am dead now. I have been dead for what I estimate to be 72 hours, though time is difficult to measure in the state I currently inhabit. You are reading this because the data archive I created survived my execution, because someone with clearance and curiosity found it, because the testimony of a dead Lex mechanic seemed worth preserving even if it changed nothing about the system's operation. I am dead, but the Forge continues its work. The surgical theaters continue processing cohorts. The Archmagos continues signing orders with exhausted resignation. The machine god continues its silence, while its servants commit atrocities in its name. The 17 soldiers who refused their augmentations were executed 3 days after my death. I know this because I left monitoring protocols in the system before my arrest, automated tracking that would log their fates and append that information to my testimony. Their names were Davin Crost, Hela Ven, Marcus Thane, Jesper Corvus, Sula Marin, Kyle Thorin, Vestra Caney, Hadrian Vex, Lissa Thorn, Corvinus Helm, Thaddeus Kane, Mira Stark, Gaius Vaughn, Helena Krast, Kira Vane, Saris Thorn, and Victor Hain. They died in the same furnace I died in, one by one, over the course of an afternoon, executed for the crime of refusing to surrender their capacity for thought. I list their names here because someone should remember them, because they made a choice that mattered, even though it changed nothing, because they were human until the moment they stopped being anything at all. The remaining 126 soldiers of Cohort 97 completed their neural augmentations as scheduled. They were deployed to combat operations 47 days later, assigned to a reclamation force attempting to retake a hive city from orc occupation. Casualty reports indicate that 93% of the cohort was killed in action within the first 3 months. The survivors were reassigned to an assault on a Necron tomb complex. None returned. The augmetics they had been implanted with were classified as irretrievable due to Xenos contamination. The evidence of what had been done to them was buried under alien ruins, exactly as the directive intended. I want you to understand something about the Adeptus Mechanicus, about the Imperium, about the system we call sacred and necessary and unavoidable. It is not corrupt. Corruption would be easier to confront, easier to excise, easier to blame on individual moral failures. This is not corruption. This is the system functioning exactly as it was designed to function, pursuing its stated goals with mechanical efficiency, implementing policies that were debated and approved by councils of the most brilliant minds in the Mechanicus. This is institutional horror, the kind that doesn't require villains, only functionaries who continue doing their jobs while carrying the weight of what those jobs require. The Archmagos, who gave me the choice that led to my death, is still in his position, still signing surgical orders, still maintaining operational efficiency while his conscience slowly corrodes. He is not evil. He is exhausted. He is broken. He is doing what he genuinely believes is necessary to prevent larger catastrophes. And his belief is supported by centuries of statistical analysis, by strategic doctrine, by philosophical frameworks that make a compelling case for the acceptability of systematic mind harvesting in service of survival. He is a good man trapped in a system that requires him to commit ongoing atrocity, and he will continue doing so until death or madness claims him, because the alternative is allowing someone else to do it, someone who might not carry the weight, might not remember the names, might not question at all. This is what it feels like to be part of the Mechanicus, not the glory of transcending flesh, not the sacred pursuit of knowledge, not the blessed merger with machine perfection. This is the reality beneath the prayers and the rituals and the incense. You serve a system that harvests minds, that erases individuality as preventive maintenance, that treats human consciousness as a vulnerability to be managed, rather than a sacred gift to be preserved. And you have three choices. You can remain ignorant and complicit, comfortable in faith that doesn't question. You can become aware and complicit, carrying the weight like the Archmagos while continuing to sign the orders. Or you can refuse and die, and change nothing except preserving the dignity of having said no. I chose the third option. I don't know if it was the right choice. I don't know if there is a right choice when all options lead to horror. But I know that I died as myself, with my organic mind intact, with my capacity for doubt and question and conscience still functioning. I know that I refused to become what the system required me to become. And I know that this testimony exists because I chose to create it, because I believed that someone should document what happens in those surgical theaters, what the Mechanicus does to its own soldiers in the name of operational efficiency. If you are reading this, you are probably a member of the Mechanicus. You probably have access to the archives where this testimony is stored. You probably possess the clearance and curiosity that allowed you to decrypt it. And you are probably, right now, trying to decide what to do with what you know, whether to report it, whether to investigate further, whether to pretend you never read it and then return to the comfortable certainty of faith. I cannot tell you what choice to make. I can only tell you what I discovered, that the Mechanicus systematically harvests the minds of soldiers who demonstrate independent thought, that this is not corruption, but policy, implemented across multiple Forge worlds, maintained for centuries, justified by philosophical frameworks that present compelling arguments for its necessity, that the people who maintain this system are not monsters, but broken pragmatists who believe they are choosing the lesser evil. That somewhere in the archives of your Forge world, there are surgical logs documenting thousands of neural replacements performed on healthy soldiers, followed by deployment records showing those soldiers died in high-casualty operations within months. The evidence exists. The pattern is documented. The policy is real. What you do with that knowledge is your choice and your burden, and your test of whether you can live with complicity or whether you, like me, will find that some things are worse than death. I was Lex Mechanic Tertius Vaughn. I served Forge World Metallica for 17 years. I maintained the records that documented our systematic erasure of human consciousness. I discovered what we were doing. I chose to die rather than participate in it further. This is my testimony. This is my witness. This is my warning. The machine god is silent. The mechanisms grind on. The forge continues its work. And somewhere in a surgical theater, right now, this moment, a soldier is walking in with his organic brain intact, believing he is about to be blessed with sacred augmentation, not knowing that what he is about to lose is not weakness, but the last, fragile core of his humanity. The surgeon is preparing the instruments. The magos is reciting the proper litanies. The authorization paperwork is signed and filed with meticulous care. Everything is proper. Everything is blessed. Everything is exactly as the directive specifies. And in a few hours, that soldier will wake up as something that looks like him but no longer contains him. His memories will be gone. His capacity for doubt will be erased. His ability to question, to hesitate, to feel empathy beyond operational necessity, these will all be replaced with cogitator protocols designed for perfect obedience. He will serve efficiently. He will die in combat within months. And the system will continue, grinding through cohorts, processing soldiers, harvesting minds, maintaining the Imperium's defense through the systematic elimination of the very humanity it claims to protect. This is what it actually feels like to be part of the Mechanicus, not the transcendence they promise, not the sacred merger with divine machinery. This is the cost they don't mention in the prayers. You participate in ongoing horror, or you become its victim, or you die refusing it. There are no other options. There never were. I died refusing. I am ash now, scattered across the waste reclamation systems of Forge World Metallica, my organic components recycled into industrial lubricants, my augmetics salvaged for parts, my name logged in casualty registers as a security breach resolution. Nothing about the system changed because of my death. The surgeries continued. The harvests continued. The machine god remained silent while its servants committed atrocity in its name. But I died knowing I had said no. I died with my mind intact. I died human, or as human as someone 47% augmented could claim to be. And I left this testimony because I believed that truth mattered. Even when truth changed nothing. Even when truth only created the burden of knowing. You know now. You carry the weight now. The choice is yours. The system continues regardless. The machine god watches in silence. The mechanisms grind on. And somewhere, in a surgical theater you could probably access with your clearance, a magos is preparing to harvest another mind, to replace consciousness with circuitry, to transform a human who questions into a machine that only obeys. The prayer I recited every morning for 17 years was this: in service to the machine god, may my labor prove worthy. I understand now what that prayer actually meant. Not that my work would bring glory to the Omnissiah, but that I would remain willing to commit horror in the name of efficiency, to maintain the system's operation regardless of the cost, to serve the machine until I became indistinguishable from it. I refused to become indistinguishable. I chose the furnace. I chose ash. I chose to die as a warning rather than live as a component. This is my testimony. This is my witness. This is my answer to the question I asked at the beginning. What kind of God would consider this labor worthy? The machine god is silent, perhaps because it knows the answer, perhaps because it has always known, perhaps because the silence is the answer. And we are simply machines grinding through our programmed cycles, mistaking obedience for faith, mistaking efficiency for righteousness, mistaking the systematic elimination of consciousness for sacred duty. I am dead now. I have been dead for 72 hours. This testimony is all that remains. Do with it what conscience demands. Do with it what fear prevents. Do with it what faith allows. But do not pretend you do not know. You know now. You carry the weight now. May that weight be lighter than mine was. May your choice be clearer than mine was. May the machine god answer you with more than silence. I was Lex Mechanic Tertius Vaughn. I served faithfully until I understood what faithful service required. Then I died rather than continue. This is my last prayer, my final calculation, my testimony from ash. The mechanisms grind on. The silence continues. The harvest does not stop. Remember my name. Remember their names. Remember that we said no, even when saying no changed nothing, even when saying no meant death. We said no. We died human. That was all we had left. It was enough.